When the waiter asked for my order at our anniversary dinner, my husband said, "She's not eating. She didn't contribute to the bill. I'll have water," I said to the confused waiter while my husband Paul handed back my menu to him without letting me look at it. We were at the steakhouse he'd picked for our 10th anniversary, and he'd made reservations without telling me there would be conditions attached. The waiter stood there awkward, holding his pad. "Ma'am, would you like to see the menu?" Paul answered for me. "She's fine. I'll have the ribeye medium rare with loaded potato." He ordered a $100 meal while telling me I couldn't eat. "Sir, is the lady not dining?" The waiter looked concerned. Paul smiled like this was normal. "She didn't bring any money, so she doesn't get to order. That's how restaurants work, right? You pay, you eat." He said it loud enough for nearby tables to hear. An older couple looked over shocked. "Paul, please. It's our anniversary." He laughed and showed the waiter his phone. "Look at our bank accounts. Hers has $14. Mine has $12,000. He'd separated our finances 6 months ago without discussing it. "She wants to be independent so she can independently pay for her own meals." The waiter shifted uncomfortable. "I could bring some bread for the table." Paul shook his head. "Bread is for customers. She's just sitting here." He turned to me. "You should have thought about dinner before you quit your job." I'd been laid off, not quit, but Paul had been telling everyone I chose to be unemployed. "I was laid off, Paul. The company downsized." He waved his hand dismissive. "Successful people don't get laid off. You weren't valuable enough to keep." The couple next to us was openly staring now. The woman looked horrified. Paul noticed and spoke louder. "I'm teaching her about consequences. No contribution means no consumption." He pulled out cash and fanned it on the table. "See this? This is what work looks like." The waiter tried again. "Perhaps a small salad?" Paul grabbed the money back. "Did you not understand? She has no money means she gets no food. It's simple economics." He looked at me. "Maybe being hungry will motivate you to find work faster. I'd applied to 40 jobs that week. You told me not to take the retail position because it was beneath us." Paul laughed harsh. "That was before I realized you're professionally worthless. Now any job would be an improvement." The woman from the next table walked over. "Excuse me, miss, would you like to join us? We have an extra seat." Paul stood up angry. "She's my wife. She sits with me." The woman looked at him disgusted. "You're starving your wife in public." Paul pulled out his phone again. "I'm teaching financial responsibility." He showed her something on the screen. "This is her spending from last month? $60 on groceries." The woman looked confused. "She bought food for your home?" Paul nodded. "With my money." "Then she has the audacity to say she's broke." He turned back to me. "You spent my grocery money, so now you can watch me eat." The waiter left to get the manager. Paul didn't notice because he was pulling up more bank records. "Look, January, she spent $30 on gas. February, $40 on medication." He showed everyone around us. "All my money. But now suddenly she needs dinner?" My medication was for anxiety, which had gotten worse since Paul became like this. "That was when we shared accounts, Paul. You said household expenses were both our responsibility." He sat back down. "That was before you became a financial burden." The manager arrived and Paul immediately started complaining. "Your waiter keeps trying to force food on my wife when I clearly stated she's not ordering." The manager looked between us. "Sir, is there a problem?" Paul smiled his business smile. "No problem. I'm a paying customer ordering a meal. She's just accompanying me." The manager hesitated. "We can't serve one person while the other sits hungry." Paul pulled out more cash. "I'll pay for her seat. A rental fee. How's $50? He put the bill on the table. "There. Now she's paid to sit, but not eat." The older woman from the next table spoke up. "This is financial abuse." Paul turned on her. "Abuse? I'm the one who pays for everything. House, mortgage, utilities, insurance. All me." He counted on his fingers. "She contributes nothing but expects to eat at expensive restaurants?" The woman's husband stood up too. "Young man, you're humiliating your wife." Paul laughed. "She humiliated herself by being unemployable." That's when things shifted. The waiter came back with the manager and a security guard. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave." Paul's face went red. "What?" "I'm the paying customer." The manager nodded. "And we reserve the right to refuse service. You're disturbing other guests." Paul stood up outraged. "This is discrimination against successful people." The security guard stepped closer. "Sir, please leave voluntarily." Paul grabbed his cash. "Fine, but she's walking home. Gas costs money." He stormed out, leaving me there. The older woman pulled out the chair next to her husband. She gestured for me to sit down, and I moved like my body belonged to someone else. The waiter appeared with the menu and opened it in front of me. I stared at the words but couldn't make sense of them through the tears collecting in my eyes. The woman put her hand on my arm. Her husband introduced them both as Matt and Natasha. I managed to say my name, but my voice cracked halfway through. Natasha ordered a chicken dish for me without asking what I wanted, and I was grateful because I couldn't have chosen anything myself. The waiter brought bread, and I took a piece just to have something to do with my hands. Matt asked if I needed them to call someone, and I shook my head because there was nobody to call. My parents lived 3 states away, and Paul had slowly cut me off from most of my friends over the past few years. The food arrived, and Natasha watched me take the first bite before she started eating her own meal. The chicken was good, but it stuck in my throat because I kept thinking about Paul driving home alone and what he would do when I got there. Natasha asked where I was staying tonight. The question made my stomach hurt worse than the hunger had. I told her I lived with Paul in a house about 20 minutes away. She looked at Matt, and something passed between them without words. Matt asked if I felt safe going home, and I opened my mouth to say yes, but nothing came out. Natasha reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. She explained she volunteered at a shelter that helped women in difficult situations. The card had an address and phone number printed on plain white stock. I put it in my pocket even though I knew I wouldn't use it. Matt wrote his cell number on a napkin and slid it across the table. He said to call anytime, day or night, if I needed help. I thanked them both and finished my chicken while they paid the bill over my protests. Natasha hugged me before I left and whispered that what happened wasn't normal or okay. I walked to my car knowing she was right, but not knowing what to do about it. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Paul's car wasn't there, which meant he'd gone somewhere after leaving the restaurant. I unlocked the front door and turned on every light in the downstairs. The silence felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath. I went to the bedroom and pulled our marriage certificate from the filing cabinet. Then I found my birth certificate and social security card tucked in the back of my underwear drawer where Paul never looked. I searched his office for bank statements, but he kept everything password protected on his computer. The desk drawers held nothing useful except old tax returns that showed how much money we'd made together before he he separated everything. I found $40 in his coat pocket and took it. Then I put it back because I was scared he'd notice it missing. I checked under the mattress and in the bathroom cabinets and behind the books on the shelves. 2 hours passed and I had a small pile of documents on the kitchen table, but no cash and no plan. Paul's car pulled into the garage at 12:30. He walked in like he'd been at a normal business dinner. He loosened his tie and asked what I'd made for dinner. I stared at him from the kitchen table surrounded by papers. He glanced at the documents and shrugged. Then he said we should forget about the misunderstanding at the restaurant. I asked him what misunderstanding he meant. He waved his hand like brushing away a fly and said I'd made a scene in front of strangers. I stood up so fast my chair fell backward. I told him he was the one who made a scene by refusing to let me eat. He laughed and said I was being dramatic again. He walked to the fridge and pulled out leftover pizza. He ate it cold while standing at the counter and told me I'd embarrassed him in front of important people. I asked what important people, and he said the manager might have been someone he did business with. He finished the pizza and went upstairs without saying goodnight. I sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning staring at the business card Natasha had given me. The next morning, I waited until Paul left for work. My hands shook so hard I could barely hold my phone. I dialed the number on Natasha's card and she answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm like she'd been expecting my call. I asked if the offer to meet was still good and she said absolutely. She gave me the address of the shelter and said she could be there at 2 that afternoon. I wrote down the directions even though I'd already looked them up online 3 times. She asked if I was safe right now and I said yes because Paul was at work. She told me to bring any important documents I had and I looked at the pile still sitting on the kitchen table. I gathered everything and put it in a grocery bag. Then I spent 4 hours cleaning the house because I didn't know what else to do with myself. The shelter was in a converted office building downtown. I parked 2 blocks away because I was afraid someone would see my car. Natasha met me at the front door and led me to a small room with a couch and some chairs. A woman named Chloe introduced herself as one of the counselors. She had kind eyes and a notebook she didn't write in. She asked me to tell her what brought me there and I started with the restaurant. But as I talked, it came out that Paul had been controlling money for years. He'd always handled the finances because he said he was better with numbers. He'd made me ask permission to buy things even when I was working. He'd questioned every purchase and made me return things he deemed unnecessary. When we had joint accounts, he'd monitor every transaction and call me at work if I spent money without telling him first. Separating the accounts 6 months ago wasn't the start of the problem. It was just the latest step in something that had been happening since we got married. Chloe explained this was financial abuse and I started crying because I'd never had words for it before. Chloe gave me a folder full of information about legal help and housing assistance. She said the first step was getting my own bank account that Paul couldn't access. Natasha offered to drive me to a bank across town where Paul didn't have any accounts. We went that afternoon and I opened a checking account with $20 that Natasha gave me as a donation. The bank representative asked if I wanted checks or just a debit card. I chose just the card because I didn't want anything with my name and address that Paul might find. The card was bright blue and had my name printed on it. I held it in my hand and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't much money, but it was mine. Paul couldn't see the balance or question how I spent it. Natasha drove me back to my car and hugged me before I left. She made me promise to call her if anything got worse. I got home before Paul and hid the debit card in a tampon box under the bathroom sink. He came home at 6 and went straight to the living room. I followed him and found him on the couch with the remote control. I tried to log into Netflix on my phone and got an error message. I asked Paul if something was wrong with the account. He smiled without looking at me and said he'd changed all the passwords. I asked why and he said because I didn't contribute to those bills either. He'd changed Netflix and Hulu and the Wi-Fi password. He told me the new Wi-Fi password cost $50 if I wanted it. I went upstairs and used my phone data to look up free Wi-Fi locations. The library had it and so did the coffee shop 2 miles away. I could live without Netflix, but I needed internet to apply for jobs. Paul called up the stairs asking what I was making for dinner. I didn't answer. 3 days later, Paul announced he had a business trip. He'd be gone for 4 days and he said it like a parent sending a child to their room. He packed his suitcase and left at 6 in the morning without saying goodbye. I waited until his car disappeared down the street. Then I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. I photographed every bank statement I could find in his office. I took screenshots of old emails where we'd discussed having joint finances. I recorded the dates when he'd separated our accounts and changed the passwords. I found receipts showing he'd spent $300 at a bar the same week he told me we couldn't afford groceries. I photographed the hole he'd punched in the wall last month during an argument. I backed everything up to a cloud storage account he didn't know about. By the end of the first day, I had over 100 photos documenting his spending versus mine and his pattern of control. My phone rang on the 3rd day of Paul's trip. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in months. Laura was my former coworker from the job I'd been laid off from. She asked how I was doing and I tried to say fine, but instead I started crying. Everything came out in a rush about the restaurant and the money and Paul's trip and the shelter. Laura listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said she was coming over. She arrived 20 minutes later with coffee and her laptop. She said we were updating my resume right now. We spent 3 hours rewriting my work history and making it look professional. Laura said her new company was hiring and she'd put in a word for me. She also knew 2 other places looking for administrative help. By the time she left, I had applications ready to submit to 3 different jobs, and my resume looked better than it ever had. Laura hugged me at the door and made me promise to keep her updated. I watched her drive away and felt something I hadn't felt in months. It might have been hope. Laura called the next morning with a list of companies looking for people to hire. She'd sent my resume to her boss and 2 other places she knew about. One interview was scheduled for tomorrow at 2 and another for Thursday morning. The 3rd company wanted to do a phone call this afternoon. I wrote everything down on a notepad I'd hidden under my mattress where Paul wouldn't find it. Laura asked if I needed a ride to any of the interviews and I said yes because I couldn't risk Paul seeing me dressed up getting into a car. She said she'd pick me up at the library both days since I'd told Paul I was spending time there anyway. I met Chloe at the shelter that afternoon to practice answering interview questions. She had a list of common ones printed out and we went through each response until I stopped shaking when I talked about my skills. The hardest question was explaining explaining why I left my last job. Chloe told me to keep it simple and professional without mentioning Paul or the financial problems. Just say the company downsized and I was part of a larger layoff. She made me repeat it 10 times until it sounded natural instead of rehearsed. Then she took me to the donation closet where they kept professional clothes for women going to job interviews. I found a black blazer that fit perfectly and a blue shirt that looked clean and pressed. Chloe added a pair of dress pants and some black flats that were only slightly scuffed. I tried everything on in the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like someone who belonged in an office. Someone who had her life together. The person staring back at me didn't match how I felt inside, but maybe that was okay. Maybe I could fake it until it became real. The phone interview went better than expected. The woman asked about my experience and I talked about my last position without my voice breaking. She seemed impressed with my organizational skills and said they'd call back tomorrow if they wanted to schedule an in-person meeting. When I hung up, I realized my hands had stopped shaking halfway through the conversation. Laura texted me good luck for tomorrow and said she'd be at the library at 1:30 to pick me up. The first in-person interview was at a marketing firm 20 minutes from our house. Laura drove me there and waited in the parking lot in case it went short. The office had glass walls and modern furniture and everyone looked busy and important. The manager who interviewed me was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, and she smiled when she shook my hand. She asked me the same questions Chloe and I had practiced, and I answered each one without stumbling. She showed me the desk where I'd be working if I got the job and introduced me to 2 other people in the office. Everyone seemed normal and friendly. No one looked at me like I was broken or worthless. The manager said they were interviewing 3 candidates and would make a decision by Monday. The second interview on Thursday was at Laura's new company. She introduced me to her boss who ran the administrative department. This interview felt easier because Laura had already told them about my work history and skills. Her boss asked me situational questions about handling difficult tasks and managing multiple priorities. I talked about systems I'd created at my old job to track projects and deadlines. She nodded along and made notes on her papers. At the end, she said they needed someone who could start soon and asked about my availability. I said I could start whenever they needed me. She shook my hand and said I'd hear from them by the end of the week. I walked out of Laura's building feeling something strange in my chest. It took me a minute to recognize it as actual hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind I'd been clinging to. 2 solid interviews and 1 more phone call scheduled for tomorrow. 3 real chances at independence. Paul came home from his business trip on Friday night. I was in the kitchen making dinner when he walked through the door with his suitcase. He didn't say hello or ask how I'd been. He just dropped his bag by the stairs and went straight to his office. I heard him on the phone talking about his trip and laughing with whoever was on the other end. When he finally came into the kitchen, he looked at the pasta I was making and asked if I'd used his money to buy the groceries. I said yes because we both knew I didn't have any other option. He nodded like he'd proven some point and sat down at the table. I put a plate in front of him and he started eating without thanking me. I sat across from him with my own plate and we ate in silence. He didn't ask about my week or mention the restaurant or apologize for anything. He just ate his food and scrolled through his phone like nothing had happened. Laura's boss called on Saturday morning while Paul was in the shower. She offered me the administrative position starting at $40,000 a year with benefits after 90 days. I said yes before she even finished explaining the details. She wanted me to start Monday, which gave me 2 days to figure out how to hide this from Paul. I thanked her 3 times and she laughed and said she was excited to have me on the team. When I hung up, I sat on the bed staring at my phone. I had a job. A real job with real money that would go into my secret account. Chloe's voice played in my head warning me not to tell Paul. He'd find a way to ruin it or force me to quit or call my new boss and sabotage everything. I had to keep this secret until I had enough money saved to leave safely. Paul came out of the bathroom and asked why I looked weird. I said I was fine and he shrugged and went back to his phone. The rest of the weekend passed in the usual silence. Paul watched television and worked on his laptop. I cleaned the house and made meals and pretended everything was normal. But something had shifted inside me. I had a plan now. I had money coming in that he couldn't control. Every day at this job would be 1 day closer to freedom. Paul noticed the change in me almost immediately. I hadn't realized I was acting different, but apparently I was. He started watching me more carefully, asking questions about where I'd been and what I'd done during his trip. I stuck to the story about spending time at the library and he seemed to accept it. But on Wednesday night, I was in the shower when I heard our bedroom door open and close. I rushed through washing my hair, and when I got out, Paul was sitting on the bed holding my phone. My stomach dropped. He looked up at me and asked what I was hiding. I said nothing and reached for the phone, but he pulled it back. He'd gone through my messages and emails and call history. I watched him scroll and scroll looking for something to prove I was lying to him, but there was nothing there. I'd been using Natasha's phone to text Laura and Chloe. All my job emails went to an account he didn't know about. My phone was clean. He finally tossed it on the bed and said I seemed different lately, happier. He wanted to know why. I said I wasn't different, and he laughed and said I was definitely hiding something. Then he left the room and I sat on the bed shaking. That had been too close. I needed to be more careful about acting normal around him. Monday morning, I woke up early and got dressed in the bathroom so Paul wouldn't see my work clothes. I put on the blazer and pants from the shelter donation closet and looked at myself in the mirror. Professional, capable, employed. I put everything in my purse and walked downstairs in regular clothes. Paul was already up drinking coffee. He asked where I was going so early, and I said the library opened at 9 and I wanted to get there when it was quiet. He nodded and went back to his phone. I drove to the library and changed in their bathroom, then drove to Laura's company. My first day went smoothly. Her boss showed me my desk and the filing system and introduced me to everyone in the office. I spent the morning learning their software and organizing old files. Laura brought me coffee at lunch and asked how it was going. I said great and meant it. By the end of the day, I'd set up my direct deposit into my secret bank account. The money would hit in 2 weeks. Real money that Paul couldn't touch or control or use against me. I changed back into regular clothes in the library bathroom before going home. Paul was already there making dinner, which was unusual. He asked about my day at the library and I said it was fine. Quiet. I'd read some books and used their computers. He seemed satisfied with that answer. This became my routine. Wake up early, change at the library, work all day, change back back before going home. Paul never questioned it. He seemed pleased that I was doing something productive with my time, even if it was just volunteering. 2 weeks passed without incident. I got my first paycheck deposited and watched my secret account grow. $400 after taxes. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I could feel the chains loosening just slightly. Then Paul found my pay stub. I'd been so careful about everything else, but I'd left it in my coat pocket after checking it during lunch. He was home early on a Thursday, and I heard him yelling before I even got through the door. He was standing in the living room holding the paper, and his face was red. He demanded to know what this was, and I tried to take it from him, but he held it over his head. He'd found out I was working, making money, lying to him for 2 weeks. I said I was going to tell him, and he laughed harsh and mean. He read the pay stub out loud, including my salary and the name of the company. Then he pulled out his phone and said he was calling my boss right now. He was going to tell them I was mentally unstable and shouldn't be employed, that I'd lied on my application, that I was stealing from the company. I watched him dial, and something inside me broke. Not in the sad way, in the way that made me finally stand up straight and look him in the eye. I told him to put the phone down. He looked surprised and kept dialing. I said it again louder. I was keeping the job. He could call whoever he wanted, but I wasn't quitting. His face went from red to purple, and he stepped toward me fast. His fist went past my head and punched the wall so hard it left a hole in the drywall. He said I'd regret defying him and stormed out of the house. I stood there staring at the hole next to where my head had been, and my whole body started shaking. That could have been my face. That should have been my face. He'd missed on purpose this time, but next time he might not. I packed my bags that night while Paul slept and left before sunrise. Natasha answered her phone on the first ring, even though it was barely 6 in the morning. She gave me her address and told me to come straight over. Matt made coffee while I sat at their kitchen table shaking and crying and trying to explain what happened with the pay stub. Natasha called Michelle Bright, the attorney, and got me an appointment for that same afternoon. Michelle's office was small but professional, and she listened to everything without interrupting. She explained what legal separation meant and how we could get a restraining order based on the hole Paul punched in the wall. I showed her the photos I'd taken, and she nodded and said we had a strong case. The paperwork took 2 hours to fill out, and Michelle said she'd file it first thing Monday morning. Paul would be served at his office, which she said was important because it would create a public record. I stayed with Natasha and Matt for 3 weeks while the legal process moved forward. Paul sent hundreds of texts alternating between apologies and threats. Michelle told me not to respond to any of them and to save everything as evidence. The restraining order came through, and Paul violated it twice by showing up at Natasha's house. The second time, Matt called the police and Paul spent a night in jail. Michelle discovered the hidden accounts during the asset disclosure phase. Paul had been moving money into accounts under his mother's name for over a year. The judge was not happy about that, and it helped my case significantly. 3 months after I left, I signed a lease on a small apartment across town. It was just a studio, but it was mine, and Paul didn't know where it was. My job had given me a raise after my probation period ended, and I could afford the rent plus groceries and utilities. I started seeing a therapist every Tuesday evening, and my new health insurance covered most of the cost. Paul's lawyer kept pushing for reconciliation meetings, but Michelle shut them down every time. 6 months after that anniversary dinner, I sat in Michelle's office signing the final divorce papers. The settlement gave me half of everything, including the hidden accounts and Paul's retirement fund. Michelle had fought hard for every dollar and won. I walked out of that office legally free and financially stable for the first time in years. Natasha threw me a small celebration dinner that night with just her and Matt and Laura. We ate good food and laughed, and I felt lighter than I had in forever. Some days were still hard when the anxiety hit, or when I saw couples at restaurants. But I had my own money and my own space, and people who actually cared whether I was okay. I was building something new, and it belonged completely to me.